Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about some useful resources for entrepreneurs or those of you who might want to become entrepreneurs. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today, we're taking a bit of a detour to talk about entrepreneurship. Or maybe it's not such a detour given the number of lawyers who end up creating solo practices or small firms, or really who leave the law entirely to start new businesses. We know a ton of people, even not just us, who do that.
Everything from cupcakes to Pilates.
Yep, you name it. We've got a lot of ex-lawyers floating around doing interesting things.
Right. And I mean, if you told me in law school that a few years later I'd be running a business, I probably would have said you were crazy. So you just never know.
Yep, me too. And even if you don't ever start a business, it is useful to think about your career path as an entrepreneurial path. You are the boss of your own career, and lots of these ideas apply more broadly. Even in the largest, most traditional firm, which both you and I worked in, you still have to, build a book of business to keep working there, make partner. You have to have an entrepreneurial mindset. You've really got to own your own career and have almost a business plan for yourself.
Right. One of the books that I like is by the founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, who wrote, I think you read this too, the book called The Startup of You.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great book for people who are listening to this thinking like, oh, I have no interest in business. I don't want to be an entrepreneur. I don't want to sell stuff. And he makes the point that, essentially you're running your career as a boss. And the earlier you embrace that, the better.
I think that's very true. And now that people change careers so much more frequently than they used to, our parents' generation, you would hear people working at the same place for 16 years, 20 years, 30 years. That's just not the reality. I can't remember that statistics of how often people are going to change careers in our current generation. Isn't it something like 6 times or something like that?
Oh, at least. I think maybe even more than that.
Yeah, but the reality is you're going to have to be making these strategic business decisions. Each job change is going to be a strategic decision. So even if you think, well, I'm a lawyer, I don't need to worry about that stuff. Every time you change firms, every time you even change your level at the firm, you really have to start thinking about your career as its own little business model.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think a lot of these skills that people talk about being entrepreneurial skills are really just skills for everyone. Mm-hmm. Right. So, let's talk about some of these resources and people that we have found useful on our journey from law to business, because I think it has been a journey. Mm-hmm. I guess for me, the first book that really put the idea in my head that maybe I could or should start a business, or at least could find a way to be in a career that didn't reward me just for working more and more hours, was Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek. Some people hate this book. Lots of people love it. I still think it's a classic. I gave it to tons of associates. I was reading it at the firm. After I finished it, I handed it out to everyone almost like a secret, like, you've got to check this out. Like, do you realize we could be working 4 hours a week? I'm not sure that's necessarily totally accurate.
Oh, wait a minute. You're not working 4 hours a week right now?
Well, some weeks, if I'm on vacation.
Exactly.
It's not a perfect book, but I think for shifting out of money equals time worked mindset that lawyers are trained to have and fall into, I still think it's invaluable. Have you read it?
I haven't, but I've read about it. And of course, I've talked to you about it. I think what's interesting is starting to just shift your mindset when it comes to either owning a business or just creating your own opportunities for what you really want. I think for me, one of the things that really changed when I started to think outside the box about leaving the firm and doing something different was that I got to create the lifestyle I wanted. I got to create the job that I wanted. And I think that in most career paths, especially in the law, you're not the owner of that. So anytime that you can release yourself from thinking I have to work 40 hours a week 8 hours a day or 60 hours a week, 6 days a week, I think it really frees you up to start thinking outside the box. So anything you can read about models where you don't necessarily work a typical job, I think can help you think creatively about how you want your life to look, and even open yourself up to the possibilities that are available to you if you want to do a non-traditional career path.
Yeah, and I think that's really the value of the 4-hour work week. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I can guarantee you Tim Ferriss does not work 4 hours a week. He's a complete workaholic. But, the point of the book is really you can design the life that you want, and you just have to make enough money to support that life. And it may actually be a lot less money than you think that you need. I mean, I think that's another trap that a lot of lawyers and young lawyers fall into is, I remember a partner at the firm I worked at telling me, in all seriousness, I just don't understand how anyone could live in San Francisco on less than $500,000 a year. And I'm like, I just kind of looked at him, you do realize what you pay your associates, and like, we all think we're getting paid a lot. Mm-hmm. So, but I think that it is easy to fall into this mindset of like, oh, if I'm not making 6 figures, like I couldn't possibly survive. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of places that's just not true.
I think it's not true. And again, it's how you make up your life. If you work for yourself, oftentimes your take home doesn't necessarily need to be the same because you're doing kind of cost shifting things to be part of your business. Possibly a lot of your entertainment can even be linked to your business, or travel can be linked to your business. I mean, you never really know. It depends on what you end up doing. But when you start to think creatively about the money that you really need, and then possibly how to take your business and combine it with some of your passions, maybe you even don't need as much money to survive as you thought you did.
Yeah, I have several law school friends who have started kind of fashion businesses, particularly ethical fashion businesses. Mm-hmm. So conveniently, they source in places that they really enjoy traveling to. And if you follow their Instagram account, it's like, oh, now we're off in like the markets in Chiapas, like buying products from these indigenous women, or oh, my business partner is off at our workshop in Pakistan, like working with our artisans. And so those are great examples of that's completely tax deductible.
Mm-hmm. I know lawyers who've become photographers. They do a lot of traveling about photography. Lawyers who've become chefs. There's a wide variety of things you can do that might be, kind of in that write-off, but still kind of entertainment space. But I think that's one of the things that can be kind of amazing about going out on your own and building your own career, is that you get to take some of your passions and really match them with work. And then work seems a lot less like work, and work is much more almost of a hobby.
Well, I think that's the danger, though. I mean, there's also the danger in turning your thing that you really enjoy doing outside of your work into your work, because suddenly you've got some of those same hassles of, oh, it's my job, I have to do this. I mean, for example, I have certain hobbies, like I like baking bread, for example, and you have very artisanal, like special bread, and people are like, oh, you should run a bakery. And I'm like, I would kill myself if I had to run a bakery. Like, that's the last thing I would want to do. I wouldn't want to do this every day, like, and get up at 3 a.m. and like have spoilage and like, oh my God, that sounds like a nightmare. Mm-hmm. So, I think you have to be a little careful if, your dream is to travel and it's like, oh, well, I'll be a travel writer. Okay, well, suddenly your entire life just became work.
Right. I think that's very true. I also think the other thing to think about is how much of the reality of the business are you, one, do you have the personality you really do? And 2, are you willing to do? And let's be honest, one of the benefits of having a business partner is you get to split up the crap work.
Right, divide and conquer.
Yeah, I mean.
And some of the stuff I hate doing, you don't mind doing, and vice versa.
Right, exactly. And we had to sit down in the early days and kind of split it up. And, it was like, well, someone's got to pay the bills. Who's going to pay the bills?
You took the checkbook away from me at some point. Because I think I didn't pay our like registration yearly fees or something. And you're like, okay, we're going to have a very serious conversation. I'm in charge of the bills in my house. I'm in charge of the bills in our business too, because you suck at this.
Right, exactly. I'm just going to do it, or else people aren't going to get paid. Who's going to run payroll? Like, it's going to be me.
Yeah, it's like there's some things you really have to pay. I mean, the thing about running a business is there's a lot of stuff you think you have to do that you don't really have to do, but there's certain things you do have to do, like, pay the people who work for you, pay the state to keep your business license active. These sort of things are not really optional.
They're not. And then you also have to be realistic about whether or not you have the skills to even, do certain parts of it. I mean, let's keep talking about finances and money. I used to do our bookkeeping, which was not super fun, but in the beginning, when we weren't making very much money, and didn't have that many transactions, it wasn't a huge deal. I could sit down with QuickBooks and do the transactions, and it wasn't problematic. And then it quickly became that someone who could work much faster and was much better at bookkeeping was needed to be brought on board. So I wasn't spending all of my time being a bookkeeper, because my time was much more valuable being spent teaching and creating coursework and doing the other stuff that we were doing. So you also have to be, willing to think about, at what point can you leap to bring in other people to outsource these tasks? Or perhaps the opportunity cost of you learning how to do some of these tasks is too high. And so you have to be willing to outsource.
Right. And I think a lot of people, the classic entrepreneurs, I want to know how to do everything and I want to do everything, which is actually, you basically have to do that in the beginning unless you got funding, which is possible. We'll talk a little bit later about some ideas about that. But, basically you are going to do everything. But I think the people who transition from kind of creating a job for themselves to creating a real business are the ones who outsource as quickly as they can and eliminate that need to be in charge of everything, which is simply impossible at some point.
It is. And I think one of the benefits of owning your own business is you can have those conversations about what do you want to keep and what do you want to eventually outsource. Alison and I get together a couple times a year to kind of do a retreat. And one of the questions we almost always ask ourselves is, what are you doing right now that you don't want to be doing? Is there a way that we can get rid of that? If there isn't, there isn't.
Suck it up.
Suck it up. But sometimes we've been able to say, you know what? Yeah, we can get rid of that. We can bring in somebody else to do that, and probably should. And then you can start to make those strategic decisions. So in a way, you can own your own happiness around tasks a little bit more. The more autonomy you have, and owning your own business does create an awful lot of autonomy.
Right. And I think, there are a couple of different ways you can do that. One is you can literally outsource to a person. You can find those people on things like Upwork and things like that. We have a guy in India right now who's doing some awesome work for us at a very low rate. And you can also think about ways to use technology. Technology has made starting a business, whether it's a law firm or some other type of business, so much easier. And, a lot of the conversations we have are, can we automate this task?
Right.
If it's a pain, no one wants to do it. Either we outsource it to someone on our team who also doesn't want to do it, or, we figure out a way to use something like Zapier, which, is this amazing tool that connects apps together and lets you pretend you're a programmer without actually having to write code. You can do some really powerful stuff using some pretty basic tools. And once that's set up, it just runs in the background and no one ever has to do that annoying task again.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things technology has done is it's really freed entrepreneurs up to trying things out without having to make a huge capital investment. I think that that's one of the things that's so amazing. Whether it's starting your own solo practice or doing something like we did, or as some sort of other legal or non-legal offering, oftentimes you don't need that much capital anymore because your business can exist first in this virtual space. And I think that's one of the things I remember when I read the $100 Startup, which I think we wanted to talk about today. But this idea that you can do a lot without a lot of seed money if you're willing to just kind of like bust your butt in the beginning and get a little creative. And I think one of the things that stands in folks' ways a lot when you talk about starting something new is people do think that the capital investment has to be huge. I think to me, it's less about capital investment and it's how are you going to fund the rest of your life while you get this rolling.
Right.
But I think that technology has allowed us all to look bigger and more spiffy than we are when we're just getting things started.
It's like, 20 years ago, if you wanted to start a law practice, there's almost no chance you wouldn't have had to, have fancy office space and all the stuff and like a copier that you spent thousands of dollars on and, a secretary to answer the phone. And now you don't actually really need any of that. You can get virtual office space if you need that when you need it. You can have a virtual receptionist. You don't need a copier. You have your phone. You can use a scanner. It's like go to Office Depot and spend $100 and you've basically got a better copier than you would be able to buy in a printer and scanner. I think the point is there's so much opportunity But you have to kind of get out of this mindset of like, oh, well, unless I can get someone to invest in my business, it's not worth doing.
Mm-hmm. Because that is a mixed bag. I know we're going to talk about investment a little bit later, but I think, the big things that make the news are always about people who get big money for their ideas and then they can do it. But of course, like nothing is for free. And, and so when you're thinking about different models of what you want to do, I do think it is important to realize, the trade-offs when you're kind of giving up ownership to another company. And one of the things that we did, and continue to do, which I think is really interesting, and we did more of this back in the early days. Of course, like you're now mostly in Mexico, which makes it harder for us to go to things together. But one of the things that we did early on is we would try and go listen to entrepreneurs talk.
Right.
And we weren't going to legal entrepreneur talks. We were just going to like basically anything that we could think we might learn something. So
we were just so crazy. Everyone was like, what? Like the one from Rent the Runway, which turned out to be super interesting.
Yeah, this woman, one of the founders of Rent the Runway, which many listeners probably know or use, was talking about how she and her business partner started the company from scratch. Really how they were bootstrapping in the beginning and doing like their own photo shoots and
like crashing like New York Times photo shoots for their articles and short dresses and stuff to try to get more publicity.
Exactly.
That's a hustle.
It was a hustle. And they were talking about entering the fashion industry, where neither of them had really been in the fashion industry, and they had to bring in people to work with them who knew the do's and don'ts of the fashion industry. I remember her story about talking about going to a meeting at one of the fashion houses, and she hadn't gotten a manicure.
I remember that.
Yes, and one of the and whoever was one of the fashion folks that they brought onto the team basically took her aside and was like, never, ever, ever come to one of these meetings without having a manicure. It's just not what's done in the fashion industry. I mean, these women went to Harvard Business School. I mean, these were incredibly sophisticated women, but they came up with this idea, being outside the fashion industry, and they had to, learn this industry. So it's just fascinating to learn from other people who are doing interesting things and have built things from scratch, because the nuggets can come out of talks that I think can be really valuable, even if they have nothing to do with the industry that you're actually in.
Oh, no, it's so fascinating that both of us, like from years ago, remember that anecdote about the nail polish. Because I was like, oh my God, that's right. She did not. She had like a chipped manicure.
Exactly. I also remember, I think it was the same year, we went to the Alt conference, which is really about creative businesses, a lot more about photographers, bloggers, mommy bloggers, wedding bloggers.
We were kind of outliers.
We were definitely outliers. But I remember some very interesting talks about blogging, about using. Isn't that where we got introduced to Flipbook as well?
Yeah, Flipboard. I was just going to say, we still have our Flipboard. I'm still posting to it all the time.
We heard some really great speakers like Meg Keane, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, just talking about building businesses. And I think as a woman entrepreneur, one of the things that can be really important too is to go out and find your group, because I think women entrepreneurs oftentimes have some slightly different challenges for a variety of reasons. But you can learn a lot from how other women make it work. And, it never ceases to amaze me how people think like it's so amazing that you and I have been able to have our business survive through one of us having a child. I feel like at a mom, at a conference where a lot of the entrepreneurs are moms, nobody would say that to us. But, in the legal space, a lot of people looked at us funny when I was pregnant, which was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I remember someone was like, well, did you tell Alison? You're like, of course I told her. Like, she was like one of the first people to know. This kind of impacted her too.
Yeah, I think you might have been number 2. Sorry, Mom.
Yeah, I was like, I hope your mother's not listening.
I know, right? I told her soon after. I just wanted to tell her in person. But of course, and actually, we talked about it beforehand, like that we were doing family planning and we were making business decisions based on that knowledge.
Right. And then, random things happen. Like I cut my hand off and didn't cut it off. Thank God. I almost cut my finger off.
Yeah.
I cut my tendon and had to have surgery and couldn't talk or couldn't type for 2 months. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. We had to come up with some new solutions, be very flexible. But I think that the benefit, if you're a woman, you're thinking about generating your own business, is that, a lot of these resources we're going to talk about happen to be men. And that's probably a whole separate podcast about why that is. But there is a female entrepreneurial community out there. And it's exciting to be a part of it, but you might have to leave the law to find a lot of those people.
Right. And even then, no one will take you seriously, but that's okay.
That's okay. They will eventually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They always come back around.
They always come back around.
All right. So, yeah, speaking of that note, one guy we really like, and this is, I think, one of my favorite ideas, and this is Seth Godin, who probably you may have heard of. If not, definitely he is your marketing, building your audience guy. He is probably one of the few emails I actually open every single morning. And one of the things he says that I think really resonates is you can always pick yourself. You know, so a lot of people are saying, oh, I can't get a job, or I can't get the job that I want, or like, you know, I'm never going to get hired by this law firm. He would just say, pick yourself, like go and figure out how to do what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And he actually did a podcast with the Building New Law. We can link to it in the show notes. It's pretty interesting about sort of the legal profession and changes in the legal profession and how to be an entrepreneur in that space.
Mm-hmm. That is really interesting. His stuff is great. It's easy to read. It's a good like commute reading if you just want to pick up a book.
Beach read. Yep. Read it on a plane. You can finish the whole book on the plane probably. Yeah.
But his ideas are packaged in such a nice way. And if you are thinking about going down an entrepreneurial route, I think you do have to kind of start thinking about turning yourself into a business or turning part of yourself into a business. And it's not like your whole life, but how you're going to market yourself. Who is your tribe? Who are your fans? Who are you? What's going to be your voice? You know, he does talk about how you don't need everyone to love you, which I think is something.
It's a hard lesson.
It's a hard lesson. You know, the first time you get negative feedback as an entrepreneur, it's rough, you know, and you always want to focus on the negative and not the majority of positive. But I follow a few different, bloggers or personalities in different spaces. And one of them recently posted something on Instagram, and I think the image was something like, you may not like me and that's okay. She's like, I'm not for everybody. Like I do what I do and I'm not for everybody.
Yeah. And I think anyone who's thinking about building a business has to think in that way. Like you can't be everything for everyone because then you're nothing.
Right.
You know, people come to you because you have a voice and you have a point of view and you have something specific to offer them. I mean, otherwise, why would anyone come to you for any sort of help? You know, basically you're probably helping someone in some way with a business, or why would they be paying you?
Right.
And if you're not providing them anything that's different, then what's the value? But if you're providing them something different, then inevitably someone is going to hate you.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the reality, and that's fine. They can find a resource somewhere else.
Exactly.
So thanks for listening. We're glad you...
If you hate us, go away or keep listening. We don't really care. We would prefer you didn't leave a bad review. But if you feel like doing that, I feel like it gives more credibility.
But we hope you like us and stick around, because we do like to have people listening to the podcast. But I think it's just the idea that the first time we got some negative feedback, it was hard for both of us to stomach.
I think it's always hard to stomach. And the people who leave that, I mean, maybe they know that they're really hurting someone's feelings, or maybe not. But I mean, maybe they just don't care. But I don't think anyone enjoys having someone tell them that like they're an idiot and everything they do is stupid. Mm-hmm. But that's just kind of what you're putting yourself out there for.
Yeah. I mean, and I think when you are really, creating something that you're passionate about, it is important for you to think about overcoming fear of doing something different, overcoming failure. It's something we talk a lot about in the law school space. Going back again to Carol Dweck's great book about mindset, you definitely have to have a growth mindset.
Oh yeah.
And then, really kind of getting comfortable with vulnerability, putting yourself out there, and the, if you had to just pick the one person in that space that we both are minorly obsessed with, of course, is all the Brene Brown books, as well as her TED Talks on vulnerability and things like that. Can be very powerful. I think she does an incredible job of putting herself out there and talks very, very honestly about that journey and her own failures and overcoming failure. And if you are struggling with that, listening to her talks or reading her books, I think, can really help you get over the hump.
Yeah, I saw her talk once, and she's so amazing. She's just like the greatest person, and so funny and humble and all that. But she said, yeah, well, I got some hate mail the other day that said something along the lines of, well, if I looked like her, I would be preaching about the gifts of imperfection too.
I remember that. I was sitting next to you. We were in the same thing.
And she was just like, and, I went into my little closet for a few seconds. It was like, that's really hurt my feelings. And then I was like, you know what? Screw you.
Yeah, it's just like, okay.
Like, what am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah,
nothing.
Yes. Yes.
And I think one of the things, I can't remember the details, but I think it's Brene Brown who kind of talks about being really careful who is on sort of your personal board of advisors, and are these people that are leaving, random negative comments on your blog posts, like, are those people really on your board of advisors?
Oh, go ahead.
I was are they adding the value that you need to listen to them? Probably not.
Doesn't she recommend that you leave a list? It's like you make a list and leave it in your wallet or something like that. So when negative things happen, you go to your list. If that person's not on your list, you don't internalize it or something like that. It is a powerful idea that, the people around you, the people whose opinions you should invest in are the people who are really close around you.
Well, and then I think for would-be entrepreneurs, that also gets a little risky because you've got to think about other people's motives and their incentives. So if you go and you tell your parents that you're going to quit your BigLaw job where you're making $150,000 plus a year and you're going to start a cupcake business, there might be some pushback.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And, it's not to say that you shouldn't do this if it's like your passion and you have a good business plan, but they're not probably going to be immediately on board with it.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
They probably shouldn't be immediately on board with it.
Yeah. You better be able to convince them or have a good plan.
Well, I feel like in some ways being an entrepreneur is almost like your like last ditch scenario. I mean, honestly, if you can do anything else and be happy, it's probably easier.
It does come with its own set of challenges and trade-offs, just like everything else, And I think, one of the things we often talk about is how, sales. A lot of people really, really hate sales. And a lot of lawyers forget that if you want to build a business, you have to sell yourself. And
if you want to build a legal practice, you have to sell stuff.
Yeah, a business, a legal practice, basically anything. If you want somebody to give you money for something, you have to do some sort of sales. And I think it is really important to start to think about that and get comfortable with it. And I used to not like selling. In fact, when I first started tutoring, my husband told me how awful my pitches were on the phone to students because he would overhear them. And he's like, oh, that wasn't good. Like, that wasn't good. Like, okay, thanks for the feedback. He's on my list, so I listened to him. But I do think that you have to get comfortable with these things, and you can think outside the box about how to get more comfortable. So one of the ways that I got more comfortable selling is I did nonprofit work for a bit. I was on a nonprofit board. I was very active in fundraising and talking about a nonprofit that I cared a lot about. And I realized that I was learning to sell the nonprofit, and I was getting very good at talking to people about it and making the ask and, making the value proposition, and that comfort level started to transition back to the business, and that I was getting more comfortable doing that for my own business and then our business when we started together. So it is interesting how these things that make you uncomfortable, you just have to find a way to get comfortable with it, and then you can really move forward without, feeling like you're being held back by some of these fears.
Yeah, on that note, one of the classic books that I read a while back and found pretty interesting is called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by this guy, Robert Cialdini, I think his name is. And the title also makes it sound really menacing. But, I mean, like you said, if you're going to be a business, you have to sell stuff. So I think it's smart to kind of get interested in what persuades people to buy. And, like with anything, you can use your powers for good or you can use your powers for evil. So if you have the perfect product that's going to make someone's life better or the ideal service that's going to solve their problem, you can't be reluctant to offer it to them. You have to, it's a shift in mindset from like, oh, I'm asking them to give me money to like, I'm actually solving their problem and they're happy to pay me for that.
Yep. I think it's true. And you have to have confidence in your value add. I mean, you do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you think you're producing crap, then, well, maybe you should feel bad about selling it.
Maybe that's true.
But I'm sure that none of you listeners would be producing crap. So,
I think that's true.
You can feel good about going out there and selling your stuff.
Other resources that I think can be helpful. I get the Harvard Business Reviews daily email, which I think is really interesting from a business perspective. If you're just wanting to learn more about how to run a business or what it means to have a business, or if you have a team, I think it can be really, really helpful. I also like reading biographies. And so when I was starting to think about this as a viable option for me and starting to make a decision to grow the business, I started reading just different biographies that kind of either got recommended to me or I thought sounded interesting. I ended up reading the Howard Schultz biography of the guy who was the CEO of Starbucks for a long time, which turned out to be incredibly fascinating. I don't really even remember how I ended up picking it up. I think I may have bought it at an airport. It turned out to be really
sounds like an airport book.
It definitely was an airport book, but it was very interesting. And I also liked the Steve Jobs book that came out 4 or 5 years ago. I thought it was also very fascinating because to read about somebody who was such a visionary. And I think for me, why I like reading about different people's stories who have been leaders or built businesses is to find what kind of sets them apart and makes them so good at what they do. And to see if there are things I can learn from or even things I can recognize in myself that, I could really invest in and try and be better at.
Yeah, one of the things I've always thought was interesting about Steve Jobs, he said, I think it was his Stanford commencement speech, like you can only really connect the dots in retrospect. Mm-hmm. So sometimes a lot of people kind of go to law school and they've had these other experiences and they're not really sure how to tie them all together. And like it seems like, oh, well, maybe it was a waste of time to do this other career or whatever. Mm-hmm. But then a few years down the road, you find it like, oh, it's all just circled back around. And now suddenly I'm interested in doing, say, a healthcare startup because I used to work as a nurse and then I went to law school. Mm-hmm. It's like you could have predicted that? Probably not.
Right.
But suddenly these pieces fall into place and like you're the perfect person to do this.
Mm-hmm. So true. Another interesting book I read in the beginning when I was first starting to think about entrepreneurship was called Birthing the Elephant, which is a collection of stories of female entrepreneurs. Many of them were also moms and entrepreneurs who were really starting some of these businesses as a side hustle. Some of them became, Bobby Brown is one of the people in the book. So something that started very small that became gigantic. So it's very interesting as well if you're looking for female entrepreneurs to read about as well. Who else are some people in the online space that we follow and find interesting?
Well, you mentioned earlier the $100 Startup by Chris Guillebeau. I mean, I think he's fantastic. He's actually just started on January 1st a daily, if you can believe that, daily podcast. Wow.
That is impressive.
Yeah, very. Profiling people with different side hustles.
We saw him speak too. He was very good.
We saw him speak. I've seen him speak a couple of times. Mm-hmm. I actually went to his conference once or twice. And he's great, and he's, the $100 Startup is literally a book of people who started their businesses with $100. Mm-hmm. And I think he required they had pretty significant revenue, like $50,000, $100,000 at the time he put them in the book. So, these are beginning to be real businesses. Yeah. So I think that podcast is probably super interesting. In the lawyer space, people may or may not know Rachel Rogers, who started out, she's gotten a lot of flack from a lot of people. But she started out, her practice and talking about virtual practices and has now really shifted into more selling products, which is a shift a lot of lawyers are interested in making, and has a product called the Small Business Bodyguard that I think is doing pretty well. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of someone who took their legal training and knowledge and transitioned it to a more general sort of client, rather than doing just, hourly billing. It's like, or do you have things you can package and sell? That might be a better way to make a living because you don't have to keep doing the work.
Mm-hmm. And Rachel's a really dynamic woman. We had her speak at one of our conferences. I really enjoyed getting to know her. I thought she was fun and interesting and had just an amazing spirit to her.
Oh yeah, I think she's great. She provokes violent reactions either way. Let's put it that way. So yeah, but again, for people who are just like, this is what I do. And if you don't like it, I don't care.
Yep.
You're not my client. You're not my person. And that's okay.
Yep.
Practically speaking, I think Pat Flynn, who runs a site called Smart Passive Income, seems like a super nice guy and also has some really useful stuff on his website. His emails are also tend to be useful. Mm-hmm. Like if you're interested in starting a podcast, he has a very useful guide to starting a podcast. We actually used it. But, you know, again, like these are just, you need to get sort of comfortable with this space and start realizing how it is that people do things in whatever area you're interested in starting a business in.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. One of the online obsessions we have is with Meg Keane, who started A Practical Wedding. She talks about how she's married to a lawyer, and we really want to become friends with her. So if you know her, you could just tell her how amazing we are. But it's not that we just internet stalk her. I actually started following her website, A Practical Wedding, back many moons ago when I was planning my wedding, and she's really turned it into an impressive empire that includes a publishing house of books, blogs, and she's got a new product, or I guess a new website coming out that's going to be more focused as a lifestyle brand called The Compact, that I'm interested to see with what she does with that. She writes some of the, in my opinion, some of the smartest woman-focused entrepreneurial writing that I think we really see in this space, don't you?
Oh, I completely agree. I think you told me about Meg Keane the first time we ever met for coffee. You're like, you need to start reading this. I'm like, I'm not getting married. You're like, it doesn't matter. And I'm still reading it. And I think she's amazing. And we totally want to be our best friends.
Yes.
So just putting that out to the universe.
Putting that out to the universe. But, you know, I think it's another, I think Meg's work and the work that her team is doing is another great example of being able to learn a lot from a business that's outside of your own space.
Absolutely.
I think I've often gotten interesting ideas for blog posts or resources just out of, I mean, how far are we from the wedding industry? Like we're pretty far.
But we basically are like, we want to copy everything they do and just turn it into our own sort of like take on it. Right. And that's fine.
Yeah. So I think getting creative about who you are emulating is really a good idea too. You read a lot of Copy Blogger, don't you?
Well, not so much anymore. I honestly feel like it used to be a lot more focused and useful, but I think it still is useful. This website called Copy Blogger, it was started by a lawyer, really about content marketing. And I think they do, if you know nothing about sort of marketing online or, you know, if you have no idea what content marketing is, but somebody mentions it to you and you're like, oh, I need to learn more about that, I think it's a good resource to go to.
I also went through a phase where I was watching a lot of Marie Forleo, I think I'm saying that right, her videos, which I thought were interesting. She was at the point that I was watching more of her stuff, you get an email where there'd be like a short video, almost like a little like TV type spot, and totally a different platform than what we were doing, but she still had some interesting nuggets. It was also just kind of fascinating to see how she was building out her business. I mean, there are really so many people that you can learn about and watch and learn from. It's pretty cool space to be in if you have some free time to start trying to look up some of these folks or follow them on social media and see what other people are doing. It might even give you some great ideas about possible directions you could take your business.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that sort of first step of just sort of figuring out what the space looks like and, well, what does it mean? Just like, what do you need to do to start a business online? Like, it's really not that complicated. And I think it's easy to get really overwhelmed and be like, well, I don't know about SEO, or I don't know how to incorporate, or I don't know this, or I don't know that. I don't know marketing. I don't know bookkeeping. It's like, well, no one who starts something like knows these things. You just have to figure it out. Right.
And speaking of folks who are thinking about like a small firm or building out a practice from an, you know, with an entrepreneurial perspective, I think you also need to research your options for automation and things that can really help your small business run. I mean, Clio is out there to help manage your practice in a way where you can have, you know, a virtual practice or a small practice with some really powerful tools that can run online. There are so many resources out there to really help you and make you feel like you're running a much more maybe powerful business when you just have your own laptop and a desk.
Yeah. And like there are tons of people who write about, you know, doing this and pros and cons of having a virtual office or this and that. I mean, yeah, if you want to start a firm, there's really no reason for you not to do it.
So I know we're running a little long, but I think we got to talk about raising money. So you have more experience talking to people about that than I do.
Well, we've never really tried to raise money, but I do some reading on it just because, why not? I mean, they're basically like anything now, there are lots of resources that are trying to make that process more transparent. A couple of people whose mailing lists I'm on, I think their stuff is good. There's a woman called Elizabeth Yin, and we can link to her in the show notes. And then another guy called Mark Suster, who writes Both Sides of the Table. But they're both venture capitalists. I think she might have been, but he definitely was also an entrepreneur. And they just have interesting kind of behind the scenes insights. And so this is an example of, I have no interest in raising money, but, it's kind of interesting to know, like, well, what are the term sheet terms mean? Just so you can kind of understand that.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you are interested in that and you're thinking kind of grander scale and you want to have like this legal tech company, there are tons of people out there you can talk to. They even throw conferences. For example, I've been to the Codex Future Law Conference at Stanford a couple of times. I'm sure there are other ones, but you're not alone out here. Like, there are lots of people who are interested, and I think you can find that community and sort of start down the path to whatever it is that you're interested in doing.
One last thing we wanted to make sure we mentioned is both Alice and I at various different points have worked with coaches, whether it be a career coach or a life coach. And I worked with, I guess she was a career coach, maybe more of a, who knows? She was just a coach. But because the lines become very blurry, life and career.
I think mine called herself a life/career coach, but if you needed it for tax purposes, she was a business coach.
Okay, there you go. But, I think that I found this work very valuable while I was trying to make a lot of these decisions about what I wanted my life to look like. What was my work-life balance going to look like? What were my priorities? How much, what did I want my professional life to look like and what that trajectory was going to be? I was doing this work. Ironically, actually, I don't know if I ever told you this. I had my very first meeting with my coach the day we met for coffee.
Really?
I did. I don't know if I ever told you
that. I did not know that, which was like 5 years ago at this point.
Over 5 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, we're about to celebrate the 5th birthday of the Law School Toolbox.
Happy birthday, Law School Toolbox. But, it was interesting because at that meeting with my coach that morning, we had been talking about what I really wanted to do. I was a bit of at a crossroads with what I was going to do professionally, and I had to start making some decisions to commit to growing a tutoring business if that's what I wanted to do. And then you and I met for coffee that afternoon. So it was
crazy.
It is pretty crazy, but I found it to be very valuable. I don't think coaching is something you need to do forever. I think it can have parameters on it to just kind of help you get over a hump.
Yeah, and I think it can also be useful if you're literally by yourself in your kitchen, which I was, like when I left my law firm job and was trying to figure out what to do next and trying to write a book and all this stuff. And I had a coach that I had worked with before and continued working with remotely. And, she did a lot of stuff about accountability and, okay, like, what are your goals for this week and what are you going to produce? And, that sort of thing can be helpful as well. And then obviously sometimes we did bigger picture stuff when I came to her and I'm like, I think I'm just going to take a break. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I just feel like I need a different direction. She's like, are you having an eat, pray, love moment? Yeah. So, it can be helpful to have someone like reflect things back to you.
It's true. And to call you out when you don't do things, to also ask questions that maybe you're hiding from, very important life planning questions, or decisions, because you don't want to have to talk about them. So it can be really a great thing if you find the right match. Both you and I did, and I think our coaches really helped us get to where we need to be. So if that's something you are interested in, I think looking for referrals for great coaches is something that you should consider.
Yeah, because the reality is none of this is impossible if you really want to do it. You can make up 10,000 reasons why you can't start something, or you can just start it on the side and see how it goes. If you Google side hustle, you will find reading material for a lifetime. There's so really no reason that you cannot do something if you truly want to do it.
Yep.
I mean, if you have an idea, you're welcome to send it to us, and we might tell you like, I don't think that's a very good idea, or we might tell you like, yeah, go for it, or oh, here's someone you should talk to, who's doing something similar. But even taking that first step, I think, can be really valuable, because most people I know who've started something as a business end up kind of liking it.
Yep. I think that's really true. And I feel very fortunate to do what we do. And I'm really happy that, we have made it 5 years. That's actually a pretty great milestone in the entrepreneurial world. Yeah, I think
isn't it like 80% of businesses go out of business or something in the first 5 years?
Something like that. So
well, here we are.
Here we are. Well, with that, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And
preferably not a bad one, because you hate us.
We do. I mean, to each their own, but we do like the positive reviews more. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. New episodes come out typically on Mondays. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. It was fun to talk about entrepreneurship, and we'll talk soon.